Have you ever walked into a room and felt every gaze not just looking at you, but weighing whether you were worthy to breathe the same air? That feeling isn't called awkwardness. It has a name: negative power. This morning, Charlene Brooks, a black CEO, stepped through the gates of a private school in a dark suit, her heels tapping a steady rhythm on the marble floor. No one said racist, but the thin frost over their smiles, the politely tilted heads, and the unspoken question, "Are you lost?" spoke for them. The receptionist glanced at her name badge, then gestured toward the vendors area. A few parents chuckled under their breath, the sound like glass cracking in their throats. Charlene wasn't lost. She was here because of a promise to her son. "You will stand as an equal, never bow to ask for permission." She wanted a school where intellect was heard before skin color, where dignity didn't require a defense. That vision burned inside her like a lamp caged in her chest. What they didn't know was this: Charlene was walking through the lobby like an undercover agent in her own story. And in just a few minutes, every natural as it should be moment would be exposed. Because when that door opened, the very people who had just looked down on her would have to look up. If you've ever witnessed or endured the invisible cuts of prejudice hit like. So the algorithm knows this story matters. Share it with someone who could use a little more courage today. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the journeys where silence becomes strength. Comment silent power if you want to see composure outlast arrogance. Racist behavior often hides in plain sight. But together, our community can bring it into the light, through calm voices and unwavering resolve. Charlene's footsteps echoed once, crisp against the cold floor. The air tightened, then loosened, like water rippling after a touch. At the end of the hall, another set of footsteps approached, youthful, confident. Light from the window panes cut into strips across the stone floor, guiding the way like sentences unfolding. Drawing a breath, Charlene tilted her head, her small smile like a semicolon, and we slide quietly into the moment the door swings open, where the story begins to bloom from a single glance, a greeting and a silence that makes the entire room listen. This is where the first chapter turns, and part one finds its voice. The autumn morning was sharp with cold, a thin veil of mist draped over St. Moreland Private School's courtyard like a sheer scarf. A row of birch trees stood in perfect formation, their leaves quivering like coins softly clinking together. Charlene Brooks passed through the gate, her heels striking the marble walkway, each clear note echoing briefly before dying against the polished walls. A gold-lettered Welcome New Parents sign hung at an angle, catching the sunlight. But what shone more vividly than the lettering were the glances around her. No noise, no commotion, just eyes calmly taking stock, as though this wasn't a reception but a quality inspection. A mother adjusted her silk scarf, leaning into her friend. On her lips, a smile that couldn't quite hide the flicker of surprised disdain. A father pretended to focus on his phone, but the sideways glance from the edge of his screen revealed he had already seen enough. They didn't look at Charlene like one looks at a guest. It was the look given to an unlabeled package mistakenly placed on the checkout counter. Whispers slid through the mist like the faint rasp of a zipper moving inside a purse. Charlene stopped in the central foyer. Instead of shrinking, she opened her bag, pulled out a neat stack of documents, and swept her eyes over the campus map mounted on the wall. Red lines marking the entrances and exits, the principal's office, the athletic complex, the library. Everything was clearly marked, except for the invisible boundary they'd drawn around her. From the corridor drifted the scent of polished wood mingled with morning coffee, clean and cold as a freshly wiped table. She remembered herself at 12 years old, clutching a school bag in front of another set of gates. The same gleaming tiles, the same need to prove something that should have been self-evident. Back then, she stayed silent because she didn't yet know what to say. Now, silence was her deliberate choice, like placing a glass of water in a room on fire, forcing everyone to look at it. A blonde woman approached, her smile stretching like an elastic band, ready to snap. Her tone was light, conversational, like discussing the weather. "Do you need someone to show you around? This place can be tricky, easy to get lost." Her friend beside her let slip a wide-eyed stare. A boy dashed past, his sneakers streaking light across the floor. His laughter scattered and disappeared around the sharp corners. Charlene folded her documents, smoothing one stray crease. She turned slightly to face the gold-lettered sign, her stance straight, not confrontational, but unyielding. In her eyes, the foyer became a minimalist stage where the most important sound was the pause between two breaths. She looked up at the woman, polite to the point where there was no hook to snag on, and in an even, warm voice asked, "Could you point me to the entrance for those who get to choose which door they walk through?" The entire foyer froze for half a beat. They didn't yet know the question wasn't about directions. It was a mirror turned back on them. The answer would come when a door at the end of the hall finally opened. From the woman in the pale dress came a voice soft as a passing breeze, but it slipped through every layer of fog. "Is she lost? This isn't a public school?" A ripple went through the foyer. Laughter cracked sharp and neat, like the sound of a zipper closing a purse. Tight, precise, loaded with meaning. A father pretended to check his email, the corner of his mouth lifting just enough to betray his intent. A young boy glanced at Charlene, then at his mother, as if waiting for the signal on what to believe. Charlene didn't move. Her eyes locked on the school's crest embedded in the stone wall, its motto etched in gold about openness and equal opportunity. The words gleamed under the lights, but the illumination in this room wasn't from the fixtures. It came from the probing beams of each gaze. She turned back, placing her documents neatly on the counter, and addressed the receptionist in a voice soft but unslippery. "I'm here for the orientation. My name is Charlene Brooks." The receptionist typed, then looked up with a thin smile. "You can wait in the vendor's lounge just down the hall. It's less crowded there. You'll be more comfortable." The words "you" and "comfortable" were paired politely but slid past her like a drop of oil. The woman in the pale dress leaned into her friend again, exhaling an empty compliment about Charlene's handbag, as though an accessory might serve as a passport. Her friend nodded, eyes unconsciously scanning every stitch. Charlene picked up her documents, closed her bag, and tilted her head slightly, as if listening to music only she could hear. Then, just loud enough for those who'd laugh to catch, she replied, "Thank you. But if I am lost, it must be because the signs here are placed in people's eyes rather than on the walls." The words dropped onto the stone floor, not heavy, not light, but enough to still a few hands mid-scroll on their phones. A father stepped forward, introducing himself with an elaborate name. He asked if she needed help carrying anything, his voice sugared over like a glaze on lemon. Before she could answer, he pivoted toward his group and winked. A cluster of chuckles followed, soft as spoons tapping porcelain. The politeness here was like a pressed wool coat, worn to hide the cold inside. It warmed no one. A small boy approached. "Ma'am, are you handing out flyers?" Charlene crouched to meet his eyes. "I hand out something else, no paper, no ink. I give my son the habit of standing tall." The boy blinked, puzzled, before being tugged away with a light jerk, like reeling in a kite wary of the wind. In her mind, memories rose of waiting outside boardroom doors. Back then, the phrase had also been 3 simple words. "Please wait here." She'd learned to breathe inward, letting the breath become a chosen silence. That silence now spread in the foyer like still water, soundless yet pulling eyes toward it. The receptionist summoned a nearby security guard. He approached with precision-drilled courtesy. "Ma'am, I can escort you to the back lounge. It'll be more convenient." Charlene smiled. She neither refused nor accepted. Placing her documents on a chair, she said she would wait here. Just as the guard opened his mouth to add something, the sound of footsteps echoed from the end of the hall, each step counting down to something about to take form. Charlene's smile deepened slightly, memory pulling her back to another morning years ago. She was 12, standing before the high brick wall of a school, clutching a notebook filled with careful handwriting. The adults spoke softly, but the walls and gates knew how to amplify every sound. Someone had told her the entrance for parents was across the street, as if entering through the wrong door were a breach of etiquette to be corrected at once. She'd glanced at her mother, whose hands always smelled faintly of soap, and heard her steady, certain voice. "Just walk through. Any gate is yours if you know where you're going." That day, Charlene wasn't sure she had the right. She stood longer than necessary, tracing the wood grain of the door like counting her own heartbeat, before daring to touch it. The fear wasn't that the door was heavy, or the hall too long. It was the weight of being measured by anything but grades or effort. From then on, she kept a strange habit. Before every door, she paused for half a second and took a deep breath. Not to ask permission, not to please anyone, but to confirm that this step was hers. Now, in St. Moreland's foyer, the habit returned. She stood straight, eyes skimming the school's golden motto of openness and opportunity. She remembered dim boardrooms, times she'd been asked to wait outside while others passed with steaming paper cups. She remembered the way chairs grew harder when polite words were used to push someone to the margins, and how she'd learned to counter it, not by speaking louder, but by sitting exactly where every gaze had to pass. Silent when silence mattered, speaking only when her words could serve as a latch. A parent walking by cleared his throat, a subtle stake in invisible territory. Charlene glanced at his polished shoes, bright enough to reflect the ceiling lights, then back to the school crest. A wry smile touched her lips. Here, everything was polished, even the fences people built out of language. And the shinier the fence, the harder it was to see. But she'd long since learned how to slip past what others thought invisible. Her phone buzzed. A short, clear message, "I'm almost there." She tightened her grip on her bag strap, set her documents neatly in place, and shifted half a step to stand dead center in the hall leading to the auditorium. It was a small decision, like tucking back a loose strand of hair. She wasn't blocking, and she wasn't retreating. She was simply standing in the one spot where anyone opening that door would see her first. It was a skill she'd learned at 12 when no one introduced her name, letting her presence speak before anyone had the chance to misname her. The air in the foyer shifted slowly, like water stirred by an invisible spoon. A guard approached, then retreated, finding no reason to intervene. The woman in the pale dress turned away, but her neck still tilted by habit, checking if Charlene had disappeared yet. She hadn't. She stood steady. Down the hall, the youthful, certain footsteps grew nearer, clearer, firmer. A hand touched the doorknob. In everyone's mind, the second hand on the clock ticked louder. And as the door began to move, what they thought was certain began to shift. The reception desk was draped in a white cloth, a vase of fresh orchids placed off to one side like a polite nod. On the glass surface, the overhead light cut a narrow streak, sharp as a blade. The receptionist's eyes were just as clear and just as cold. Charlene set her handbag down and stated her name clearly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone who had learned how to unlock difficult doors with words alone. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood, white walls, neatly framed artwork, every detail chosen to speak of propriety. And yet, the most obvious standard here lived in the tiniest movements. The way someone tilted their head just enough, the way a corner of the mouth tightened and then loosened, delivering a discreet verdict. The receptionist lowered her eyes, her 10 fingers dancing over the keyboard. The tapping sounded like rain on a glass roof, pleasing but never soaking in. Charlene observed without drilling into anyone's gaze. She scanned the row of chairs, one labeled for alumni, another for donors, another for the press. At the very end, tucked beside a tall potted plant, sat one chair with no label at all. No name, no sign. Just a padded space, part accident, part intention. A faint smile touched her lips. In a place where everything liked to be labeled, the unlabeled always told a different story. A mother passed by, her perfume leaving a visible trail in the air. She glanced at the desk, at Charlene's shoes, at the computer screen, 3 quick flicks of the eyes like 3 ellipses. Charlene shifted just slightly, enough to step aside but not enough to avoid meeting her gaze. She brushed her fingers lightly across the orchid petals, so thin you could almost hear them tremble at the passing of a hand. She said thank you before hearing any answer, as if courtesy itself was a spare key she kept in her pocket. The receptionist looked up, her smile thin as wax paper. "Please wait a moment. We'll need to double-check." Charlene nodded. "I'll still be here." The words pinned themselves in place. Not confrontational, not retreating, simply steady. She walked to the unlabeled chair and sat down. Back straight, hands folded neatly over her file folder. From here she could see the desk, the main doors, and the school crest. The chair with no name suddenly felt like a small stage where no introduction was necessary. An unclaimed seat was fertile ground for anyone who knew how to plant. She thought this and remained still, as if planting something invisible. The click of heels passed, then faded into the hallway. A shuffle of paper, a faint cough. All of it became background to Charlene's deliberate silence. She didn't check her watch. She counted her breaths. Each one pulled her closer to center. At 12 years old, she had stood before a school gate and learned to say her own name. Today, she sat in a nameless chair and let it speak for itself. A student walked past, paused for half a second. His eyes met hers, then he kept going. That was all it took for the air to shift. Sometimes what changes a room isn't a loud voice, it's an exchanged look that understands. The receptionist made a phone call, her voice fine as a thread. She glanced up and saw Charlene still in her place, not moving, not flustered. Her smile deepened in a way that filed someone into the note column. Charlene answered with a calm nod. In her mind, a dry, almost amused thought appeared. If this chair needs a name, I can lend it mine for a while. Just as she was about to rise and walk in on her own terms, the screen at the reception desk flashed, a line of text making those glassy eyes pause for half a beat. The nameless chair had just been given a story to tell. The screen flickered, then went dark again, like a small fish breaking the water's surface. The receptionist blinked once, twice, and closed off any sign of surprise. She inhaled, straightened her shoulders, and drew her smile across her face like a curtain. Her voice slid out smooth. I'm sorry, your name isn't on the list. You can take a seat in the vendors area. The word vendors was enunciated slowly, as if placing an invisible exclamation mark at the end, but hiding it so as not to trigger a reaction. The air cooled by half a degree, like silverware just pulled from the freezer. A nearby parent chimed in, his tone warm in that distant way. Maybe you should use the back entrance. It might be easier for you. Back entrance. 2 words disguised as directions, but combed backward through the grain of history. Charlene looked down the hall toward the rear courtyard, where cardboard boxes had just arrived, still smelling of fresh paper. She nodded as if noting the information, then turned back toward the school crest with its ribbon about openness and opportunity. The motto stood there, soft but unbending, like a witness unsure which side to defend. I hear you, Charlene said, her voice as even as still water. But if I sit in the vendor's area, will anyone here be supplied with a little extra courtesy? A thin streak of light passed across a few eyes. Her answer was neither sharp nor evasive. It simply placed the center of the conversation back where it belonged. The receptionist's smile stayed, but her eyes narrowed. I hope you understand. The list today is very specific. We just follow the rules. Charlene nodded slightly, agreeing with the background music. Rules are a path, but signs can be placed where everyone sees them, or where only the familiar can find them. She tilted her head toward the corner. The nameless chair still sat there in its neutral upholstery belonging to no one. She walked over, pulled it out just slightly, and sat. The movement was slow and precise, like placing the final stone in a flat surface. A father approached, still clutching his phone like a passport. He offered to show her the way, pairing it with a compliment about her handbag that felt like camouflage. Thank you, she replied. I can find it myself. Then she turned to the receptionist. If my name isn't on the list, could you give me a blank sheet of paper? I'll write it in myself. The offer was as light as a pin, sharp enough to pierce 2 layers, surface politeness and the quiet intention to edge someone out. A short silence followed, like the moment before ink hits paper. The parent who had suggested the back entrance chuckled under his breath, but the sound faltered when he saw the way Charlene sat. Not small, not folded in. Straight-backed, composed, letting the light fall evenly on her face like an unspoken introduction. The receptionist turned back to her screen, lips moving to read something only she could see. In the next second, the desk phone rang, its sound short as a snap of the fingers. She picked up, listened to a brief instruction. Yes, I'm handling it, she said before setting the receiver down. She looked at Charlene longer than etiquette allowed, then stopped herself as if remembering a detail worth noting. Her hand reached into a drawer, pulling out a blank sheet of paper and a pen. And just as she placed it on the glass counter, footsteps echoed again from the far hallway. Louder now, like a countdown to something about to be revealed. Charlene set the pen down on the blank page, then slid it gently back toward the receptionist. A polite offer returned unused. "I'll wait," she said. The words were smooth, without barbs, but they left a deep line in the air. Her phone buzzed lightly in her bag. She glanced at the screen. "Mom, I'm 5 minutes away," then locked it without a sound, as if folding a letter into the top pocket of her chest. She chose the nameless chair beneath the shadow of the tall plant. Leaned back, hands interlaced. From here she could see every pathway in the lobby. The front door, the back door, the reception desk, the crest above, the hum of the AC, the occasional click of heels disappearing around a corner. The weight began to flow, not the empty kind, but the kind that settled in with purpose. She knew you didn't always need to push a door open. Sometimes you just had to stand in the right place, and the door would recognize it should open for you. A mother carrying a toddler passed, casually asking what time orientation started. Charlene smiled and gestured toward the announcement board, a small movement that felt like reassurance. The woman thanked her, then walked faster, as if realizing there were many kinds of light in the room. Not electric light, the kind that radiates from the way a person sits, or from a voice that puts words exactly where they belong. The receptionist straightened the orchid vase. She glanced at Charlene, no longer wearing the thin smile from before, but not yet another one either. Between the two was the pause of someone reconsidering. Charlene met her gaze and nodded as if to confirm, "I'm still here, and I have all the time I need." Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck a single dry note. Outside, the wind stirred the birch leaves, their shadows falling on the stone like pages turning. Charlene thought of her son, of the evening they had stood together reading the printed class list, him pointing at the teacher's name, and asking if this place would be as fair as the book said. She had answered with one short line, "Fairness is something you bring with you, so no one can take it away." Today she had brought it here in the form of composure. The man who had suggested the back door returned, softer this time. He asked if anyone had helped her yet, his tone dropping into an unspoken apology. "I'm fine," Charlene said. "If I need anything, I'll ask." Then, with a light prick of humor, "And if you need more seats for the vendors section, I can donate the one I'm in. It's quite convenient." The man gave a tight smile, which broke silently against the glass of the reception desk. Charlene reached into her bag, took out a tissue, and dabbed away the dew clinging to her wrist. Her heartbeat was steady as an unspoken stopwatch. 3 minutes, she thought, without checking her phone. In this moment, she wasn't trying to convince anyone to believe differently. She was simply changing the measurement. Here they measured by names on a screen. She measured by being in the right place at the right time. A security guard began to approach, then stopped, realizing he had come too close to something that didn't need guarding. He gave an awkward nod. Charlene returned it. Every small movement in the lobby seemed sharper now, like when your eyes adjust to the dark and shapes begin to emerge. Her phone buzzed again, just 2 words this time. "I'm here." At the end of the hallway, a hand closed over the door handle. The mental second hand in everyone's head ticked louder. And as the handle turned, slowly, deliberately, Charlene's silence suddenly had its own voice, one strong enough to make the entire room hold still to see what exactly was about to walk in. The salt and pepper-haired man took the seat beside Charlene, wearing a smile just friendly enough. A faint glint caught on his cufflink, and the scent of his cologne lingered like the last mist of morning. He asked if anyone had helped her yet, his voice soft as a freshly laundered towel. Charlene answered with a nod, while his eyes roamed, measuring the dimensions of the room with an invisible tape measure. He set his phone on his knee, the screen lighting in rhythm with his breathing. A greeting, a compliment on her coat, a remark about the weather, strung together like beads on a string he'd rehearsed for years. He tilted the phone casually, the lens slid toward Charlene at a very narrow angle. On the glass of the reception desk, the phone's reflection doubled, the second image lying at a slant like an unspoken confession. Through that reflection, Charlene saw it all more clearly. His steady hand holding the phone, the thumb making slight movements, a frame appearing and vanishing in a blink. She could almost hear the silent click in her mind, even though the shutter sound had long been disabled. He opened a chat window. The group name at the top appeared in neat, clean letters. Front row parents. Tiny circular icons lined up like buttons, most showing smiling middle-aged faces. He typed quickly, deleted a word, added another. Guess who's lost? Attached beneath was the photo he had just taken, brighter than the white background, like a shard of ice set on a warm wooden table. Charlene remained seated in the nameless chair. Her posture was neither defensive nor inviting. She heard the faint scrape of a chair behind her, the sound of paper sliding against a plastic folder, the receptionist's small exhale as she bent over her logbook. She knew this choreography well, politeness used like a curtain. The more you draw it back, the more you see the empty space behind it. People often believe they're capturing an objective moment, but every camera reflects the one holding it. He was still smiling, a smile that never reached his eyes. In a lowered voice, he asked the perfunctory question, "Here to drop your child off for orientation?" The question sat beside the open group chat on his screen, a contradiction that needed no pointing out. Charlene looked directly at him for a brief moment, long enough to create a pause. Then she thanked him softly for his concern and added a gentle barb. There are many good guides here. Sometimes they forget to check the map in their own pocket. He chuckled under his breath, but his thumb was busy. It hovered over the send icon, scrolling through a contact list. Two names, nearly identical, popped up one after the other like twin windows side by side. One was the group, the other an individual contact. The reflection on the desk showed Charlene the exact moment his eyes narrowed. Just then, a message from another group appeared at the top of his screen. His thumb missed, a faint buzz sounded. Charlene didn't check her own phone, but the bottom of her bag gave a short vibration. Across from her, his thumb froze mid-air for half a second, like a bead slipping from its string onto the marble floor. When he looked up, the friendliness on his lips had to steady itself. Something had gone off its straight line. The photo had landed directly in the parents' group chat. The caption glowed just below it. Guess who is lost? A smiling emoji sat harmlessly beside it, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Blue dots popped up one after another. A text bubble appeared. Looks like she's looking for the janitor's closet. Another. Do we even have a dress code for parents? Then, she'd fit better in the vendor section. The man glanced at Charlene as though he'd sent nothing at all. His polite smile stayed in place. On the desk's glass surface, the reflection showed every word that had just lit up. The receptionist busied herself with paperwork, but her lashes fluttered as if catching a cold draft. The air in the lobby tightened a notch. A child balanced on tiptoe for a look, only to be pulled away. The buzz of orientation day faded into a muted backdrop. That's when Charlene's bag gave a quick vibration. A message had arrived, complete with photo. The very same photo, only this time with a slightly wider frame, catching a trace of overhead light. Below it, a trail of comments. The group name, the timestamp, the name of the person who hit share. Someone had missent it. Their chat window and Charlene's number differed by only a few characters, sitting right next to each other in their contact list. A private joke meant to stay hidden had landed in the lap of its subject. Charlene lifted her phone, but not to her chest like a shield. She set it on her knee, screen up, letting its white glow spill across the glass desk. She read each comment like labels along a narrow aisle. One parent reminding the group to remain polite in public conversation. Another using a word that sounded like praise but was meant to diminish. Another offering details about the vendor section, as if confirming they'd guessed right. She wasn't angry. If there had been anger, it had been filtered out years ago when she learned how to let silence stand in the right place. That filter caught the debris and poured out something drinkable. She glanced at the nameless chair and knew she was sitting exactly where she was meant to be. The jabs didn't push her back. They simply outlined the slope of the floor. The salt and pepper man rotated his wrist, pretending to check the time. His lips twitched, ready to resume the safe topic of pleasant weather. In the group chat, the likes and laughing emojis kept bouncing. Charlene typed a short line into the reply box for the person who'd sent it by mistake. No explanation, no lecture. Just 6 words, enough to serve. We'll meet again in the auditorium. She read it over once more, testing its straightness like a carpenter's chalk line. If she pressed send, the message would cross the small screen and land in the very room where every chuckle was waiting. It wasn't heavy, but it placed a mirror squarely in the path. Whoever walked past would see themselves, even for a second. Relaxing her shoulders, Charlene tapped send. She lifted her gaze down the hall where a younger figure was approaching. In that moment, she smiled faintly, a sign it was time to draw the line. The message flew off. Phones buzzed in several pockets. Between the snickers, one breath faltered, breaking the rhythm, signaling the thread of the story had just changed direction. At the far end, a hand gripped the auditorium door handle. No one in that group yet knew the later in her text was about to become now, right here under these lights. The message left her screen like a pebble dropped into a still pond. Charlene placed the phone back on her lap and looked straight at the auditorium doors. Across the lobby, other phones buzzed, almost in unison. Faces in small clusters shifted tone. Someone coughed, someone tugged at their hemline, someone bent to retie shoes that had never come undone. We'll meet again in the auditorium. 6 simple words, but they plucked the invisible string, connecting those who thought themselves too busy to above. Charlene sat still, feeling as though she'd pinned the center of the map in this room. No need to speak further, the words were already at work. From the reception desk, the receptionist looked over, her blinks slower now, as if she'd read something capable of rearranging the delicate order of the morning. No one fully understood, but everyone knew it wasn't an empty invitation. It was like a ticket without a seat number, an open call to step into a space where the light would shift. She remembered her mother's voice. Just keep walking, as long as you know where you're headed. Some words guide without shouting. Today, she carried one of those, sent to a cluster of people who had stood together long enough to think they were the map. She looked up at the school crest. The motto about respecting differences still hung there, bright and silent. She smiled slightly. In a place that loved slogans, sometimes a small act is needed to give the words weight. The salt and pepper man glanced at his phone, then at Charlene. A flicker of unease crossed his face, the look of someone who had just seen his own name reflected in glass. He switched off the screen, trying to revive the weather conversation, but the weather in the room had shifted. Not the air, it was the silence, thicker now, more ripened, like fruit ready to drop. Charlene let her eyes leave the faces and rest on the auditorium doors. She pictured the heavy wood, the polished hinges, the soundproofing that kept every note inside from leaking out. She thought of her son, of his stride, of how he'd learned to stand straight without reminders. The earlier message still glowed in her mind. Mom, 5 minutes away. 5 minutes wasn't long, but long enough for a room to reconsider its own face. Her purpose was clear and simple. She hadn't come to argue, she'd come to reset the measure. When people talk about priorities, all she did was place one small detail in the right spot and wait for everyone's internal clock to adjust. As a girl, she'd stood at a school gate and learned to read her own name. Today, she sat in the nameless chair and let the entire room read the meaning of auditorium again. One parent, having read the group's chat, seemed momentarily blank. She asked her husband what time the auditorium would open. He answered softly, as if afraid to drop the fragile order they were holding. Charlene heard it all, but her attention stayed elsewhere, on the door handle resting like a note waiting to be played, on the footsteps converging toward it, on the slim gap between 2 breaths where a story can turn. She placed both hands on her folder, back straight, eyes bright. Outside the glass, birch leaves swayed. Inside, screens went dark one by one. A thin shaft of sunlight angled across the stone floor, drawing a line straight to the entrance. And then, as if to confirm her message had landed exactly where it should, the handle turned. Just enough to make a small click. Someone nearby looked up, and the entire lobby seemed to inhale together. Because after that click, no one would be asking who was lost anymore. The chime rang out, its sound clear as a drop of glass falling into a bronze basin. The stream of parents dispersed, then gathered again into an orderly flow. Dark coats brushing past one another, the scrape of shoes against marble forming a steady ribbon of sound. In front of the heavy wooden doors, a security guard stood like a wall, grown up from the floor, his solid frame blocking the way. A small sign beside him bore two simple words, "Welcome in." But his arm said the opposite. Charlene lifted her folder and stood squarely in the door's path. From there, she could see everything telling the morning's unspoken order. Name tags glinting on lapels, glances exchanged like coded signals. A few smiles stretched just far enough not to tear at the corners. No one shoved, but several stepped slightly left to avoid her, the way one might sidestep a patch of paint not yet dry. The guard raised his list, eyes scanning the dense block of printed names. His voice dropped a note, careful as if handling something fragile. "Please hold the line. Verification needed." From behind, the receptionist approached, her perfume drifting past like a brushstroke. She nodded at the guard, then turned to Charlene. "Ma'am, if you could please step back a few paces, it'll make things easier for everyone." Charlene stepped back exactly one pace. No more. She looked at the door, its glossy varnish reflecting her face in a faint blur, like a photograph still in the darkroom. Overhead, a pendant light cast an oval of brightness, sliding across the foreheads of those about to pass through. She heard someone telling their child to stay close inside, the dry rustle of fabric against fabric. Everything matched other formal mornings, polite on the surface with a thin, nameless film spread underneath. The guard looked again at his list, his hand placed across it like a polite barricade. "Sorry, your name's not here. Please move to the back." Charlene nodded, her eyes never leaving the metal door handle. She asked in an even tone, no louder than half a note. "Does that list update by the hour? Because sometimes the last name to enter ends up in the front row." A parent behind her chuckled. The laugh faded quickly when the guard turned his head. She angled her body so others could pass, then stood at the exact edge of the light. There, she was neither blocking the way nor disappearing. From that vantage point, she saw the salt and pepper man tucking his phone into his pocket. The receptionist's blink slow as the desk phone flashed. Small details fell into place like beads threading a quiet strand. The woman in the pale dress appeared again, turning her face to avoid brushing Charlene's shoulder, then setting down her words as delicately as placing a silver spoon on china. "Main doors are for guests. The rear entrance is for support staff. You'll be more comfortable there." Charlene's smile was soft enough to resist fault. "Thank you for the suggestion. I'm always comfortable where I am, especially when I'm standing right in front of the door." The guard cleared his throat, irritated at words with no sharp edges to grip. He gestured to the red velvet rope stretched across the way. "Please, stand behind the rope." Charlene stepped back half a pace just behind it. She rested the folder on her hands like someone weighing something familiar. Outside the glass, birch leaves trembled, their shadows skipping over the stone floor like names dancing across paper. The air thickened in the way only waiting rooms know. The announcement inviting guests into the hall still played on a small corner speaker, but the footsteps had thinned. Someone adjusted their collar. Someone else pushed their phone deeper into a pocket. Charlene's gaze held on the door handle where light had just revealed a fine scratch. She tilted her head as if catching a knock only she could hear. And at that exact moment from inside, the handle trembled faintly, like an answer looking for the right person to give it to. The guard had just repeated, "Your name's not on the list," when a staff member approached. Her blazer was pressed, her name badge gleamed, her smile both gentle and elevated. She greeted Charlene with perfect courtesy before suggesting she wait in the outer lobby until verification was complete. Each word fell as lightly as chalk dust, yet lined up into a clear border between inside and outside. Charlene held her folder at her chest, her voice calm. "I understand, but if I wait outside, will my name appear inside any faster?" The staffer blinked, either not hearing or pretending not to. She repeated her request, adding a thin layer of sugar to the words "until completed," as if everything was already decided, only awaiting Charlene's retreat. Charlene tilted her head, looking past the woman to the crest on the wall, its words about respect and opportunity gleaming above. She gave a short smile. "I'll wait here, where everyone can see me when the door opens. That way, it's convenient for both sides." It sounded like a second courtesy, but it shifted the weight, because by sitting there, she made everyone passing by confront the question of where they were going and what they were leaving behind. The staffer kept smiling, but her mouth had tightened. She turned to the guard for help. The velvet rope was lifted slightly higher, as if raising the invisible boundary. Charlene moved back exactly half a step, then slid an unmarked chair to the rope's edge and sat down. Her back straight, hands resting neatly on the folder. No one could claim she was blocking the way, but she wasn't fading into the wall either. A parent whispered to a friend, "Rules are rules." The other nodded like receiving a proverb. Charlene turned slightly toward them, her voice even. "Do the rules here list the position of this chair? If not, perhaps it belongs to the one who knows when to sit." A small ripple passed over a few faces. The words weren't bitter, just exact. They closed a gap. The desk phone rang suddenly. The receptionist answered, listening, eyes darting from Charlene to the staffer. "Yes, I've seen her." She hung up. "We still don't have your name, but we're updating the list. Please cooperate and move to the outer area." Charlene nodded. "Cooperation is fine." And she shifted her chair to where the doorway's reflection caught her face clearly. "I'm cooperating by sitting still. When the update comes, I'll be the first to hear." Her voice was warm and soft, but it had a spine. It neither pushed nor yielded. The staffer changed tactics. "May I see your invitation?" Charlene reached into her bag, pulled out an envelope, and drew out a pristine sheet of blank paper. She placed it on the glass desk with a smile. "When the name isn't on the paper's just background. I'll wait for the name to arrive first." The blank page lay there beside the densely printed list. The comparison spoke for itself. A boy glanced at Charlene, then at the motto on the wall. His mother bent down, whispering something, perhaps telling him to look more closely. In the lobby, the footsteps had thinned to almost none. The air pooled around the doorway, where the human wall still stood. On the door's handle, the metal glinted. Charlene leaned slightly, as if hearing the room's breath. The staffer raised a hand, ready to speak again, when from the end of the hall, a deep, steady male voice called Charlene's name, each syllable set down like a seal. The entire lobby turned toward the sound, and for one brief moment, the wall before her seemed to find a crack. Charlene nodded, slid the unmarked chair to the rope's edge, right at the hall's entrance. She sat tall, hands on her folder like a stone anchoring the room's balance. From that spot, every path converged on her. Anyone entering had to look up and meet a steady presence. The building's polished surfaces sliced her reflection into narrow panes, each like a name tag needing no print. She drew a deep breath, letting waxed wood and fresh orchids blend and settle. Around her, the rustle of coats, the whisper of tightened laces, a child's soft question an adult didn't want to answer. She had stood outside many doors, heard these same sounds, and learned a simple lesson. Sometimes you don't have to push inside. You just have to sit where the inside must open. A passing mother gave a half smile and a nod. The salt and pepper man passed, phone screen dark, his fingers still half shielding its edge. The receptionist straightened her stacks of paper as if laying down a pre-written apology. The staffer stood angled, her smile measured, as though everything was in its place. Except Charlene. Charlene returned a thin nod. If there was a line to stand in, this chair was the front of it. She leaned back just a fraction, shoulders loose, eyes fixed on the handle. In her mind, a memory at 12 surfaced like a slowly developing photograph, standing outside a school gate, repeating her name until it felt safe to step in. Today, she didn't need to say it aloud. She let the silence speak. Silence had its own cadence, its own weight, and when placed right, it made people listen without a single order given. Carefully, she looped her bag strap shut, closing a bracket others had left open. On the wall, the slogan about respecting differences glowed steady. She smiled faintly, irony rising and fading. In a place fond of mottos, the best test was to seat someone where the motto had to face itself. The nameless chair had become the fulcrum for that test. If it needed a name, she could lend her own for a while. If it didn't, it was because the person sitting there already defined the space around it. The stream of people thinned. The PA invitation receded into the background, replaced by the rhythm of waiting breaths. The guard glanced at her, uncertain. No rulebook to bar someone sitting still. The staffer seemed about to speak again, then stopped, as if realizing they'd overlooked something. Charlene stayed as she was, her calm like a lake after wind. She heard the faintest click of metal inside the door, as though the hinges were testing their strength before working. A boy walked past, eyes curious, then lifting to the crest overhead. His mother's hand slowed half a beat when she met Charlene's steady gaze. That fraction of a moment was enough to shift the room's color. The murmurs in the corner stilled, as if reeled in by an unseen string. Then, from behind the wood, familiar footsteps stopped directly opposite her. A shadow stood tall and bright against the hinge. A hand rested on the handle, marking a point. Charlene tilted her head slightly, ready for the moment when every gaze would be forced to pivot. As the metal turned a fraction, she knew what she had planted was about to take root. Because once the door swung open just another hand's width, the question of who was lost would no longer belong to her. From inside, a few parents turned, their eyes like they were studying a painting hung in the wrong place. They didn't speak aloud, only adjusted their collars, tilted their heads with familiar precision, letting their judgment pass through a glance like a thin coat of paint. A tall man lifted his brow slightly upon seeing Charlene seated right at the edge of the velvet rope, exactly where every pair of eyes had to pass. The woman in the pale dress narrowed her gaze, as if deciding whether what she saw was an inconvenience or an out-of-place decorative piece. No one moved closer, yet the space between them and Charlene seemed to shrink on its own, as though her stillness was pulling an invisible thread, binding each person's attention. Charlene stayed still. She wasn't trying to be likable nor to project resilience. She simply kept her breathing steady, contained, letting the nameless chair do its work. From her spot, she could see the selective generosity of smiles reserved for the right people. She saw a mother bend to tell her child not to speak loudly, then speak louder herself. She caught the salt and pepper man giving her just enough eye contact to appear cordial before turning away, as if he'd fulfilled some social duty. It was the kind of soundless noise where every small movement was its own sentence. A girl of about 8 paused briefly in front of Charlene. Her voice was clear, bright, when she asked her mother why the woman wasn't allowed in. The mother hesitated, fumbling something about procedures. Charlene leaned forward slightly, smiling at the child. She said she was waiting for someone important. The girl nodded firmly as if understanding something adults love to complicate. A few grown-up faces flickered with discomfort at an answer too simple to refute. The receptionist brought over a tray of paper cups and placed it on a side table, a quiet offer of water meant for those standing. Charlene thanked her, accepted a cup, and set it down beside her without drinking. She listened to the sound of the water hitting the cup, clear, brief like a punctuation mark. One parent glanced from her to the cup, unsure which mental category to file her into. Charlene kept her faint smile. In places obsessed with labels, even a cup of water without a name could disrupt the order. Another mother approached, her voice honey-sweet. "Can I help you with something?" Charlene answered softly that if the hall ran out of chairs, the one she was sitting in could be borrowed. The woman froze, nodding as though she'd understood a joke, though there was no laughter in it. A few glances passed like fragile threads. Inside, the wooden doors remained shut, but the air felt as though a window had been cracked. She let her shoulders drop by a single finger's width, letting warmth settle on the fabric. Memories of standing outside meeting room doors years ago played like short reels. Back then, her silence came from not knowing if she had the right. Today, silence was her way of picking up a piece of chalk, drawing a faint line, and inviting the room to grade itself again. Her satire wasn't in her words, but in how she used composure as a mirror, making each passerby catch a glimpse of themselves. A father cleared his throat, trying to steer the moment elsewhere. He asked about the time, the side entrance, things he already knew. Charlene replied briefly, enough to be clear. She didn't correct each detail, she corrected the way questions were framed by refusing to carry their urgency. Slowly, the lobby's rhythm began matching her breath. Slower, clearer, less performative. Then, as if confirming the pause had ripened, a faint metallic click sounded from behind the wooden doors. The salt and pepper man was the first to turn, followed by several others. Charlene placed her hand lightly on the cup, not to drink but to anchor the moment. After that click, a chain of movements would follow, and some of those eyes would soon have to see themselves from another angle. At the door's edge, the shadow of a uniformed collar sliced briefly through the light like a thin blade. A casual voice drifted out, just loud enough to reach the crowd. "Is there a dress code for parents?" No one answered, but a few eyes dropped to Charlene's collar, then to her shoes, like folding rulers measuring one last hemline. Another woman swept past, complimenting Charlene's bag with feigned warmth, her pupils tightening with the reflex of someone checking every stitch. It felt like they were hunting for an authenticity stamp on her face. Charlene set her cup back on the table, her voice calm. "If there's a standard, maybe it starts with how we look at each other." She slid the bag's strap behind the chair, returning the item to quiet, no longer a passport for wandering eyes. The gesture was small, like tucking away a strand of hair, but it returned the gaze to the eyes and the judgment to its rightful owner. The woman in the pale dress raised her brows. "At this school, we encourage courtesy." Charlene nodded. "So do I. Courtesy is when you can compliment someone without checking the serial number." Somewhere in the room, a soft cough sounded, like chalk tapping a board. The air shifted by half a tone. A young father lifted his phone for a low, rushed shot. Charlene angled her chair so the frame caught only the school crest high on the wall. She smiled. "If you want a keepsake, that crest says exactly what everyone here believes." It wasn't sharp, but it froze his thumb mid-press, as if realizing he was standing in the wrong light. The receptionist stepped up, offering a small printed label. "Please wear this while we verify your details." The pale sticker, faint ink, like an unfinished apology. Charlene took it, thanked her, and stuck it on her water cup. "Everything likes a label here, let the drink wear mine. Maybe it'll taste sweeter." A few couldn't hide their smiles, though they were the kind best sipped behind a cup. Another floating remark landed. "In places like this, parents usually dress a bit more neatly." Charlene's eyes moved along the row of chairs, spotting a man in loafers without socks, a mother in a sweater with a small snag at the wrist. She turned back, her voice light as a thread. "Neat is when your child learns to see others as human." The woman's wrist twitched, caught by an invisible hook. On the side table, her labeled cup left a neat wet ring like a seal. She set the folder beside it, shifting her chair to align directly with the door, not to block, but to invite. Invite anyone passing to meet a presence that needed no illustration. Her stillness wasn't defiance, but it revealed the sounds people thought they'd hidden. The lip curl, the hushed vendor, the label scanning gaze. The salt and pepper man tried to steer the talk to weather. "Cool morning, isn't it?" Charlene hummed. "Cool, if people stop editing the air with polite questions they don't mean." He smiled, the smile slipping like a bead-off thread, landing somewhere on the marble floor. A little girl glanced at the label on the cup, then back at Charlene. Charlene leaned in. "You know, sometimes they put labels on water because they can't put them on the sky." The girl laughed, bright enough to ripple the tight air. A few parents hesitated as though seeing themselves in the receptionist's polished counter. Just then, the desk phone blinked, its short ring like a signal in Morse. The receptionist lifted the receiver, her eyes widening, then narrowing, flicking toward Charlene. Charlene rested her hand on the folder, her calm intact. Every line spoken so far had arranged themselves into a sequence, leading straight to that door. On the other side, footsteps had stopped right in place. A hand touched the handle. And when the metal turned, all those labels would have to find somewhere new to stick. The footsteps came from the far end of the hall, stronger, clearer with each step. At first the sound was like a stray raindrop, but then it became a steady tapping on the marble, pulling an invisible thread straight to the nameless chair. Every whisper faded on its own. The air expanded, then contracted like water just before a boat appears. Charlene tilted her head slightly. She knew the cadence of familiar shoes, the way the toe landed when the wearer felt no need to prove anything. When her son started middle school, she taught him to walk evenly through rooms where people looked down. "You don't have to make noise," she'd said. "You just have to let your steps say exactly what needs to be said." Now, those steps were doing the work, replacing any introduction. Faces near the door shifted shades. The salt and pepper man straightened, as if called by name without hearing it. The pale-dressed woman adjusted her hem, her eyes fixed on the handle as though it were a clock about to strike. A young mother raised her phone, then lowered it, realizing the lens wouldn't capture what stillness was holding. The receptionist's hand hovered over the velvet rope, dropped, then rose again, as if it could adjust the entire flow of time. The supervising teacher glanced once more at the list, mouthing a few dense names, but the list couldn't record footsteps. Lists only note what's familiar. What was about to happen didn't have a box yet. The steps drew near. Through wood, through glossy varnish, through air scented with wax and fresh orchids, the tapping met the door. Charlene's finger rested lightly on the folder's edge, not gripping. She remembered her son's question the night before. "If they don't listen to me, should I speak louder?" She'd answered, "Sometimes you just step into the light and the room will lower its own voice." A boy asked his mother why everyone was so quiet. She started to say it was because the bell was about to ring, then stopped. The shoes had stopped, right outside the wood. It was like a play staged entirely by silence. No one saw the director, but everyone stood ready for the third act. Charlene straightened the corner of the label on her cup, a smile flashing like passing cloud. Water got a label because people couldn't label the sky. She lifted the cup, set it down again, leaving a perfect wet ring. When a few eyes slid to it, she lifted her gaze to the door, and in that instant, she thought of her mother. Walk when you know where you're going. Any door will answer. At the hall's end, someone's breath touched the wood. A hand gripped the handle. Light slid over the metal in a narrow band. Charlene straightened half an inch, her eyes leaving the cup to align with the door. A tiny smile appeared. Not to challenge, only to confirm presence. Around the lobby, phone screens went still, as if they'd all received the same signal. The handle turned, slow, certain. The hinges whispered a faint invitation. Charlene heard those shoes step halfway into the light. Those who'd praised her bag, who'd asked about standards, all lifted their heads together. And just before the face inside came into full view, one thought flashed like a quick bolt. In the next second, they would have to relearn how to name the person before them. What name they chose? That answer was standing just behind that thin line of light. The door swung open, not with a crash, but with the soft exhale of metal giving way. A blade of hallway light sliced into the foyer, splitting the taut air in two. A tall young man stepped through that seam of light. His uniform was crisp, the white collar as if just freed from its tissue paper, shoes polished to mirror the ceiling lamps. On his lapel, a small badge caught the light, a quiet glint that knew how to introduce itself without a word. He stood there for half a beat, long enough for the room to register that a new axis had just been set. The air sagged, then shifted. The salt and pepper man lowered his phone as if lowering a small flag. The woman in the pale dress unconsciously straightened her hem, her eyes dropping to his shoes before lifting again, as though scanning an internal scorecard she had just invented. The security guard in front of the door eased back half a step, a movement so slight only someone fluent in detail would notice. At the reception desk, the clerk touched the edge of an orchid vase and turned it a fraction, the petals trembling like a whispered aside. Charlene sat up straight, sliding the unmarked chair directly into the path of that light. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She simply lifted her cup of water and set it down again, leaving a perfect wet circle. A mark in time. Quiet memories moved through her, a small hand gripping hers on the first day of kindergarten. The time her child asked why some doors opened differently for people who looked the same. The evening she taught him to walk evenly through rooms that judged with their eyes. Just walk, and let your footsteps say what needs to be said. Now those footsteps were speaking for the entire hall. The boy's gaze swept the room, unhurried, unwavering. It passed over the practiced half smiles, paused on the taut red velvet robe, then cut straight to Charlene. In that instant, every silent label seemed to lift off its surface. No more stitching her handbag for flaws. No more questions about dress codes. A person had walked in, and his presence alone made the old measuring sticks sag. A little girl in her mother's arms leaned forward, whispering, "Who's that?" The mother murmured something she herself wasn't certain of. The boy carried the air of someone at home here, but not in the way of a passing guest. His gestures fit the house's rhythm. The slight tilt of the head when greeted, shoulders held steady, a stride calibrated just so. On his lapel, the badge wasn't alone. There was a narrow ribbon, something the school's own knew without needing a program. The faculty lead took half a step forward, then stopped, as though remembering the sentence she'd meant to say had just changed subjects. The salt and pepper man tried to summon a friendly smile, but it landed wrong, like a misplaced pin on a suit. Jokes that had fluttered around minutes ago now lay heavy on the stone floor, sinking like pebbles in water. The boy left the strip of light and walked into the shaded space where Charlene sat. With each step, the invisible distances in the room contracted. The rope meant to divide now served as a guide. The guard angled aside, creating a small opening like an unspoken parenthesis. Charlene rested her folder on her lap, eyes steady on him. She didn't need to say a word for their connection to be understood. Her calm made it obvious. He stopped in front of the nameless chair, his shadow stretching across the cool stone to touch the drying ring of water. He drew a short breath, and the room's hearing focused like a lens. The first words he spoke wouldn't just be a greeting. They would turn the key in the lock. And once turned, the room's neat order would have to rearrange itself. He stepped closer, embraced Charlene in a sure, contained hug, then looked out over the hall. His voice was clear as a morning bell. "Good morning, Madam Chairwoman." Not Mom. Not Mother. The words Madam Chairwoman fell onto the stone. Precise, final, like a stamp pressed square. For a moment, the air contracted. The salt and pepper man's shoulders sank. The woman in the pale dress released her hem, her gaze wavering as if she'd accidentally flicked the wrong switch. The guard stepped back half a pace. The receptionist straightened, hands folding together as though they needed something to hold on to. Silence spread, not because there was nothing to say, but because the old words no longer fit. every assumption quietly tagged onto Charlene dropped like loose clips. In a place that adored rule boards, one greeting had turned the board to face itself. She wasn't someone who needed showing the way. She was the one who had drawn the map they'd been casually explaining to her. The boy stepped back from the hug, glancing politely at the guard. "If you'll excuse us." His tone was calm but knew where to land. The guard cleared his throat to say something, then didn't. The words "Madam Chairwoman" still hanging in the air like fresh paint. The faculty lid scanned the 3 columns of names in her list, then looked at Charlene with a brand new smile, the kind worn by someone who just realized they'd been facing the wrong arrow. A few parents glanced at their phones as if expecting the screen to tell them how to proceed. Instead, their own reflections stared back. On the table, Charlene's labeled water cup gleamed under the warm light. Turns out the thing worth labeling wasn't people. It was the habit of sizing them up by fabric and wallet. She touched the cup lightly, as if peeling tape from skin. The boy turned to the cluster of parents nearby, his face as composed as if he'd seen them at countless ceremonies. "If you'll excuse me, I'll be escorting Madam Chairwoman into the hall." The words "excuse me" were in the right place, making politeness an action. The little girl from earlier nearly clapped, then stopped, her eyes wide. Her mother murmured something, but couldn't mask her own disquiet. The salt and pepper man tried to thread the conversation back. "Have you been here long?" The boy's reply was short, long enough to know who's a guest and who's at home. It wasn't sharp, but it was as clean as a leaf's edge, glancing off the glass tabletop in a straight reflection beside their curved smiles. Charlene rose. She wasn't triumphant. Her smile tilted just enough to say everything until now had been wrapping paper. Inside was the reality. Quiet presence outlasts the chorus of politeness. She turned to the receptionist. "Thank you for suggesting the vendor's wing. Today it seems they've supplied us with a lesson instead." The receptionist blushed, nodding like someone hearing the line they should have said from the start. The boy leaned in, unhooking the velvet rope like a door swinging open. Charlene stepped through, leaving the still warm, nameless chair behind. On the other side, the hall waited like a sealed box, and Madam Chairwoman still floated above it, promising the next turn. She glanced toward the front row, where a few faces were suddenly unsure where to put their hands, then gave her son a slight nod. Whatever he was about to say into the microphone wouldn't just be a welcome, it would decide who had to rise and who got to sit. And when that sentence came, some very familiar chairs would become nameless ones. Her eyes met the woman who had once whispered she was lost. Back then, her voice had been a blade hidden in silk. Now, in the thick silence of the room, that same woman fumbled for words. Her hand on her bag strap hesitated, the bracelet on her wrist going still, as if even sound had nothing to cling to. She looked around, searching for the safety of a familiar ritual, only to find such rituals suddenly useless against a greeting that had reset the order. Charlene didn't bow, and she didn't square her shoulders. She simply inclined, offering the woman a dignified retreat. No many words. She spoke slowly, clearly, just enough for the right ears. Perhaps we've all been reading the wrong map. In places crowded with signs, people forget to ask where they're actually going. The sentence fell softly, but carried a submerged thread. The woman pressed her lips together as if she'd bitten into a word cut too straight. A child tugged her hand, whispering, "Who is she?" The woman muttered something without a subject, then dipped her head toward Charlene as if asking permission to move on. Courtesy returned, but slower now. Careful, like someone stepping into a dark room and waiting for their eyes to adjust. Charlene lifted the blank sheet that had been on the glass table, turned it so it caught the ceiling light. It was still empty, but no longer meaningless. She set it on the nameless chair she'd vacated, marking a lesson. Some seats wait for the right person to name them, with nothing more than presence. Then she pressed her palm gently to the labeled water cup, spreading the faint ring into an even border. The label stayed put, but the roles had swapped. The water had a label, the person did not. The boy glanced at the woman in the pale dress, his look steady, not hostile. "Excuse us," he said. "Just loud enough." The guard moved aside. The receptionist stood straighter, her hand smoothing the countercloth without thinking. The faculty lead set her papers down, perhaps hoping for the sound, but the sheet stayed silent. Nothing here was willing to play the part of easy witness anymore. The woman jumped when her phone buzzed. In the group chat, Charlene's earlier message glinted cold. "We'll meet again inside the hall." She looked up to find Charlene's tilted smile, not gloating, but the smile of someone who's just watched a needle land true on a compass. Charlene didn't twist the blade. She pulled the needle free. "Would you like to go ahead?" she asked evenly. The woman shook her head, stepping back to open the way. A small gesture, but the whole foyer seemed to hear a latch shift in their minds. Questions about dress codes suddenly felt surplus. Only one question remained. Where had I been standing all along? From inside the hall came the sound of a microphone testing. One soft screech, then quiet, like someone clearing their throat before reading a name. The boy placed his hand on the velvet robe, creating an opening just the width of a breath. Charlene nodded in thanks, her gaze passing over the front row where a few faces no longer knew where to rest their hands. She moved forward, slowly, giving those left behind time to name the feeling in their chests. At the threshold, she glanced back at the woman in the pale dress. "If you still need a map, I can show you the way out," Charlene said, her tone so gentle the bar became direction. The woman nodded quickly, catching her breath. And as the boy pushed the wooden door wider, the microphone inside came alive again, its clarity like an invitation. Whose name would be read first, and whose would have to learn to listen? That answer was waiting, just beyond the thin curtain of light. The principal almost ran to them, his robe flaring lightly with each stride, his hand extended before he even stopped. He clasped Charlene's hand with both of his, as if trying to pin the handshake to the present so it wouldn't slip away, repeating her name and title over and over. Madam Chairwoman Charlene Brooks, Madam Chairwoman. The sound traveled through the hall like a silver thread, stitching up the pockets of silence that hadn't yet found their meaning. The velvet rope was pulled aside, the security guard stepped back, his eyes betraying the realization that the door he had been guarding all morning had opened simply with a name. The receptionist stood tall, hands clasped perfectly in front, her smile still fixed, but its shade altered. The teacher in charge dropped the attendance list on the counter and smoothed its edges, as if hiding the slight tremor in her fingers. Parents who earlier had measured others with their eyes now felt themselves being measured by the weight of a title. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "What does chairwoman mean?" The mother didn't answer right away, as though running a translation through her head. Charlene gave the principal's hand a small squeeze, enough to thank him without indulging in ceremony. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes catching the microphone waiting on the wooden podium inside the auditorium. Its shadow on the wall looked like a pen poised to write. Her son stood half a step to her right, back straight, expression steady. Together they formed a clean, simple line, and in that simplicity the room seemed to suddenly find its axis. The principal spoke quickly, as if afraid the words might outrun him. He mentioned the school's plans, the launch of the scholarship fund, upcoming meetings, and at the end of each point he returned to the safe anchor of Charlene's name and title. Each repetition shifted the air another notch, like someone adjusting the brightness of a light. The salt and pepper-haired man started to arch a brow, then stopped, his spine stiffening as if against a cold chair back. The woman in the light-colored dress gripped her bag handle so tightly her smile thinned to a fragile thread. Charlene listened without interrupting. Her silence wasn't a mirror for others to admire themselves in. It was a curtain lowering, forcing every roll back to its real name. She thought of the nameless chair still warm behind her, the blank sheet of paper resting on it like a marker. In a place obsessed with labels, sometimes the label itself was what led you astray. Her gaze swept the front row where familiar faces, trained to smile at the right moments, now fidgeted with their hands. The principal invited her inside. He bent slightly, not from fatigue, but from the instinct of someone who'd learned when to bow to what was stronger than words. As Charlene stepped through the doorway, a soft draft slipped in through the wooden frame, carrying the faint scent of fresh orchids and floor polish, as if the room itself was letting out a long breath. The security guard held the door at just the right angle, like someone relearning courtesy. She paused on the threshold, glancing once toward the reception desk. The glass still bore the circle of moisture from her water glass, the label still clinging to its side. She smiled faintly, like placing a small period at the end of a finished paragraph. Then she stepped into the light where the microphone waited. Above, the school crest glimmered quietly. Below, her heels struck 2 even beats on the polished floor. The principal gestured for her to begin the opening remarks. Charlene set her folder on the podium, fingertips brushing the cool wood, the chill sliding into her skin. She looked directly at the front row, the ones who had once questioned her qualifications, now waiting for an answer that would help them reframe themselves. She opened her mouth, breath steady, eyes bright. The first words she was about to speak wouldn't be loud, but they carried the weight of a key. And when that key turned, some chairs would keep their names, and some would lose them. The scattered whispers in the hall faded into awkward smiles, faces stiff yet trying to soften, like someone pulling a cover over scratched furniture. A man cleared his throat, straightened his tie, and stammered an apology for the misunderstanding. The woman in the light dress pressed her lips together, searching for something safe to say, and settled on apologizing for her haste. A few nods rippled through the front row, some habitual, some sincere. Charlene smiled, neither suppressed nor overly broad. She let the apologies fall to the floor, untouched, untrampled, unclaimed. Then she turned to the receptionist, her voice as light as placing a spoon on a teacup rim. "Oh, I still want to know where the supplier area is, as you mentioned earlier. I'm afraid I might have sat in the wrong spot this morning." The words moved through the air like a thin blade, cutting exactly where they needed to. No one bled, but the grain underneath was exposed. The receptionist started to speak, then stopped. She looked down at the spotless glass counter where the water ring still lingered like a seal yet to dry. Her apology came out low. She meant the waiting area in the back. Charlene nodded. "That's easier. The waiting area in the back will need a new sign, so everyone knows it's not just for people who look like delivery staff." On the table, a pen rolled and stopped, as if in agreement. A parent stepped forward, offering an explanation that today's process was unusually messy. Charlene didn't shove the excuse away. She placed it beside the pile of apologies, then met the front row's eyes. "I have a habit. When someone invites me to the back door, I ask where it leads. If it opens to a narrow room, I wait. If it opens to the light, I walk. Today, I chose to sit, because I wanted everyone to see the light shift on its own." She turned to the principal, her smile darkening into something deeper. "I believe the school is big enough for an apology to become an adjustment. We can start by putting the right names in the right places. The waiting area is the waiting area. And the suppliers, if you must use that word, should remember that what parents bring here isn't just tuition. We supply our children with a lesson in how to treat others. Don't make them return that lesson at the door." A soft murmur ran through the crowd, not because her voice was loud, but because it struck the right nerve. The salt and pepper man bowed his head, this time unable to summon a replacement smile. The woman in the light dress pressed her lips together, then thanked her for the reminder. She offered to help hang a new sign after the event. Charlene replied shortly, "Better to change the word than to change the sign. Words lead, attitudes follow." Her hand rested on the podium, eyes sweeping the rows like measuring a street before repainting the lines. The principal nodded quickly, as if already holding the draft for new wording. He hesitated, asking if she would give the official opening remarks. Charlene smiled and stepped half a pace back from the mic, making sure her next words would be a choice, not a reflex. She glanced toward the door they had entered earlier, where the water ring still caught the light. Then she lifted her chin, voice warm and steady. Before I speak about the scholarship fund, I'd like to spend a minute on something small. It costs nothing. Only the way we call each other by name. The room leaned forward as if a curtain had loosened on its own. A child whispered to her mother, "How long is a minute?" The mother replied, "Long enough to change a habit." Charlene's fingertips brushed the mic. The faint crackle was like a switch flipping. She inhaled, selecting the 12 words she had carried all morning. Just as her lips parted, someone in the front row reached into his pocket. A phone buzzed with an oddly sharp vibration. A new message in the parent group chat. They didn't know yet that what she was about to say would make them change the group's name. A few parents bit their lips, their breathing betraying the tension. Charlene turned to her son, giving the smallest nod. He understood instantly, signaling back, then stepped half a pace ahead, moving like someone long trained to guide without noise, to open a path without pushing people aside. The velvet rope lifted, sliding through his hand like silk, finally called by its true name. The principal moved politely to the side, the gesture of someone who knows when to step out of frame. Charlene followed, her stride half a beat slower than her son's. She let that tiny gap exist as a reminder. The generation before doesn't need to rush ahead to prove itself, only to keep pace so the next generation can find its own light. Passing the front row, she saw hands lower their phones, eyes narrowing and then widening, as though trying on a new way of seeing that didn't quite fit yet. She thought of the labeled glass still sitting outside, and the blank sheet left on the nameless chair. Those inanimate objects suddenly had a voice. Water labeled, chair nameless, signboard blazing. This morning, each had contributed a word to the story. The rest was for her son to complete. He tilted his head toward her, whispering for her ears only, "I'll open on the mic, then you speak." In private, the title shifted back to its rightful place. Warm, brief, like a stone slipped into a pocket. They reached the podium. The principal placed a hand on the wood, quietly asking if she needed anything else. Charlene shook her head, inhaling so the scent of cool wood and fresh orchids merged, drawing a straight thread from chest to brow. From here, she could see the surface details slipping off the room's skin. Arranged smiles, rehearsed greetings, apologies used like tissues. What remained were children's eyes, round, clear, waiting for a sentence simple enough to carry home but deep enough to keep. She remembered her mother's words, "Walk when you know where you're going." Today she had stepped into her rightful place, but more importantly, she had placed her son into his. In a world obsessed with labels, perhaps the greatest gift was teaching him to stand tall without one. Her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, not to steer, but to transfer calm. He nodded, inhaled, and placed his fingers on the mic switch. In the front row, the salt and pepper-haired man closed and opened his eyes as if changing lenses. The woman in the light dress gripped her bag, then released it, her hand floating without anchor. A few parents bit their lips, bracing for accusation, but Charlene wasn't here to accuse. She was here to fasten a new habit, calling each other by the right name, from the door to the seat. Her son touched the mic, his voice low but clear. "Before we start orientation, I'd like everyone to read aloud the line on that crest above." The whole auditorium looked up instinctively. The words had been there for years, but today they were no longer background. They were a mirror. Charlene smiled because this was the moment when language would lead and attitude would follow. She tilted her head, giving her son the smallest nod. He understood, turned to face the audience, and with one hand, pressed the control for the large screen behind the podium. The board lit up, pure white, wide enough to hold an entire habit. And right then, in a room holding its breath, Charlene stepped half a pace forward, ready to deliver the 12 words she had guarded all morning. Because when that sentence landed, some chairs would suddenly become nameless, and a few familiar front row seats would have to learn where their real place was. The hallway stretched ahead, sunlight streaming through the tall glass panes and slicing the stone floor into neat golden squares, like pages of a book already opened. Fine dust floated lazily in the beams of light, each speck suspended like a tiny musical note hanging midair. Charlene and her son walked slowly, their steps steady and warm, the echoes of her speech still lingering like the scent of fresh orchids clinging to her sleeve. Behind them, the auditorium doors closed without a sound, sealing in a silence that had just been rewritten. People parted along the corridor like water flowing around a perfectly placed stone. A few parents tried to smile, but their smiles felt like a quick swipe of cloth over a glass still fogged with breath. The silver-haired man froze when his eyes met the boys, then dipped his head in greeting. The woman in the pale dress adjusted her bag strap. A familiar motion, but slower than usual, as though she had crossed an unseen threshold and only just realized she was in another room. Charlene walked through the squares of sunlight, each one a step for a new thought. She remembered being 12, standing at the school gate, repeating her name silently over and over before daring to knock. Today, she didn't repeat her name. She repeated her breath, and the room she had just left had heard it. Silence, if placed precisely, could shift the direction of an entire road. At the reception desk, the cup with the label from earlier had been moved to the back. The label had been peeled off and stuck onto a bulletin sheet. A handwritten line, still wet with ink, read, "Shared waiting area." The receptionist looked up awkwardly as Charlene passed, then gave a small nod, as if returning a minor debt. The nameless chair was still there, but the blank sheet that had been left on it was gone. Perhaps someone had realized that not everything needed a label in order to exist in the right way. Phones buzzed quietly in a few pockets. The old parent group chat now carried a notification of a name change. The new name was so simple it was hard to argue with. Parent Group. No rows in the title, no notes about rank. Someone accidentally turned their speaker on, and the sound of a stiff, embarrassed breath escaped before being cut off. The faces that had once enjoyed measuring others were now staring into the black mirrors of their phones, seeing themselves instead. The boy glanced at his mother, his eyes both proud and calm. In a whisper meant only for her, he said, "Let's see the classroom first, then we'll stop by the library." Their private cadence returned, soft and steady like a string pulled just right. Charlene nodded. Some victories needed no applause, only the next step, letting the light shift naturally with your movement. A little girl trailed after them, tugging at her mother's hand, eyes still locked on Charlene. She asked softly, "Who is that lady?" The mother knelt, whispered something, then looked up and nodded toward Charlene. That look was as simple as a ticket through a gate. No paper, no stamp, just the right understanding, arriving exactly on time. Charlene smiled, not to receive, but to give. They reached a bend where the sunlight fractured into smaller squares. From the opposite direction, a janitor pushed a cleaning cart, stopping to let them pass. "Have a good day," he said, his words feeling genuine because they carried no conditions. Charlene returned the greeting, her eyes drifting to the overhead signs. One arrow pointing to the auditorium, another to the library, another to the main entrance. None pointed to a back door. Far away, somewhere in the lobby, the soft click of a lock opening echoed faintly. A figure had broken away from the earlier front row cluster, hurrying forward like someone who had been lost too long on a familiar path. A hand lifted, trying to call out. Charlene and her son paused at the edge of the light, turned and waited. Calmly, because what happened next would reveal more than any slogan. Who really needed directions? And when the voice called out, the whole hallway would know the answer. No one followed them directly. But the gazes from behind clung to Charlene's back like stubborn shadows, moving with the even rhythm of their steps, as though each one pulled a thin, invisible thread, still tied to the old room. The air in the hall was cooler, yet the back of her neck still felt the warmth of eyes, curious and unsettled, like the breath of a crowd that hadn't yet learned how to name what it had just witnessed. A man from the front row broke away from his group, walking quickly before hesitating, unsure how to begin. He coughed lightly, holding out his phone like a pass for permission. He suggested taking a photo together for the parents' newsletter, calling it a memorable moment. Charlene tilted her head, her voice polite but not soft. Memorable moments don't need a lens, only a memory that knows what's worth keeping. The man laughed awkwardly, pocketing the phone, looking like someone who had just realized he was standing on the wrong stage. Another mother hurried forward 2 steps before slowing, the wheels of her carry-on clicking against the floor. She said she wanted to thank Charlene for the lesson that morning. Charlene smiled, nodded, and asked what grade her child was in. The woman answered hesitantly, then admitted she had written a few unkind things in the group chat. Charlene didn't press. She simply spoke slowly. When you know you've spelled something wrong, the best thing you can do is start from the beginning. The woman nodded as though she'd just been handed a thin dictionary. At the reception desk, the young woman placed another handwritten sign beneath the shared waiting area notice. The letters were neater now, the strokes more confident. She met Charlene's eyes and dipped her head, not out of deference to a title, but to truth. A maintenance worker passing by saw the new sign and asked if it should be permanently mounted. The receptionist said no, not yet, because the words still needed to be considered. Charlene walked past, feeling her heart settle like water after wind. From the far end of the hall, the silver-haired man reappeared. This time, he didn't hide his phone. He held the screen up, showing Charlene the renamed group, and quickly added that he had deleted the photo. He wanted to shake hands. Charlene took his hand, brief, firm, exact. The photo isn't what most needs deleting, she said. It's the intent behind the lens that needs relearning. He nodded, a rare, genuine nod for the morning. Mother and son turned into a new patch of light. Behind them, quiet fragments of conversation bubbled like small air pockets. Someone talking about posting a new sign, another suggesting that at parent meetings, they should read the school motto aloud. Charlene heard it all without looking back. She thought of the library's scent, of the wooden table under the windows where children often shared silence. In a place where silence has rules, people are forced to be careful with their words. A boy ran past, almost bumping into her, stopping just in time. He apologized quickly, his eyes clear. Charlene waved it off, asking if he knew the way to the library. He pointed, his smile lighting like a small lamp. Her son noticed the edge of quiet pride tracing his lips. They stopped before a large glass panel. Outside, birch trees cast shadows like straight lines on paper. Charlene turned, looking back along the path she'd walked. The group of parents had dispersed, but the traces of their unease still lingered on the floor, like chalk lines not yet wiped away. She knew it would take them time to get used to a map, without shortcuts called prejudice. She leaned toward her son, unlocking a door only the two of them knew. "Do you still have the blank paper?" He nodded, tapping his pocket, his smile crisp as sunlight. Charlene tilted her shoulder, her pace loosening. "When we reach that corner, we'll write a sentence. Short enough to remember, straight enough to resist bending." The boy nodded, eyes bright. And in that moment, while the hallway still felt taut, they inhaled together. A smile small as wind brushing leaves was about to form. Because when that quiet laugh escaped, someone would realize the answer they'd been searching for all morning was already walking right past them. The one who had called them earlier stood now at the edge of the light. It was the woman in the pale dress. Her step faltered, her voice caught between 2 apologies and 1 old habit. She said she wanted to ask for directions, then rearranged her words as though searching for letters on water. Charlene turned, not loud, not curt. She asked where the woman wanted to go. Into the auditorium or outside for a breath. The woman glanced toward the window, then at the new shared waiting area sign, nodding as though finally seeing a simple map she'd never noticed. Charlene pointed toward a sunny corner with chairs by the window. "It's cooler there, and you can see the garden. If you sit for a while, when you stand, you might find the road straighter." Her words landed like a small stone placed on the grass. The woman nodded, her eyes softening. She thanked Charlene without embellishment, then took her child's hand and led him to the garden view chairs. The boy looked back, waving at Charlene's son, his smile lightening the weight of the hallway. Mother and son walked on. On the wall, the school crest glinted in a thin strip of light that moved with them. At the reception desk, the young woman was peeling labels off the remaining water cups, drying their rims slowly as though relearning every courtesy. She looked up and greeted them quietly. Charlene asked if the blank sheet was still there. The receptionist pulled it from a drawer. Charlene folded it in half and placed it in her son's hand. Blank paper still had its uses, especially when you needed to write a new sentence. They stopped before the main doors to the courtyard. Sunlight swept across the floor like a line of gold chalk. The boy opened the paper and wrote 2 neat lines. He held it up for his mother. She read them and smiled, a contained, warm smile. He folded the paper and tucked it into his inside pocket. When the time comes, I'll read it where it matters. Charlene nodded. Exactly. Read it where they're not used to hearing it. Behind them, the parents shifted again. They faced each other briefly, then themselves for longer. Someone opened their phone, staring at the new group name, looking as if they'd found their own signature on a strange form. Another approached the desk, borrowing a pen to make the words "shared waiting area" bigger. Hand unsteady, but line straight. The receptionist added an arrow pointing to the chairs by the window. Small gestures, but enough to open airways in a morning full of guarded walls. Charlene looked at her son and remembered the night they'd sat at the kitchen table, practicing calling things by their right names. When you meet a door, try your name before you knock. If it doesn't open, don't break it. Change the light. The boy nodded. This morning, the light had changed places. Not through noise, but through a greeting placed exactly where it belonged. They turned toward the library. The scent of old paper welcomed them like a sweater warmed in the sun. Charlene placed her hand on the doorknob, then glanced back. Far away, the hallway seemed to stretch, the people in it already scattered, but their silence still printed on the floor. She didn't feel triumph. The closest feeling was lightness, like removing a pin from your coat without tearing the fabric. Her son asked if they needed to go back to the auditorium. Charlene shook her head. When they need a sentence, we'll return with this paper. He nodded, opening the library door. Just before they stepped inside, they both laughed. A soft laugh, thin as wind slipping through birch leaves. It lingered light as air, but pressed heavy into the hearts of those still standing behind. Because perhaps it was they, not Charlene, who had been lost all along. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.